Hello fellow cyborgs and welcome to my February wrap-up. I'll be talking about the books that I read in the month of February that were not rereads. Those will come up in separate Hindsight is 2020 videos. The first thing I finished in February was Jazz by TONI Morrison. This I buddy read with Sarai from Sarai Talks Books. This is the second book in, I don't know what it's actually called, but Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise are a historical trilogy of Morrison's. The last Morrison I read was Beloved, and so I decided I want to continue with this loose trilogy in Jazz. However, I did not enjoy this very much. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. The narrative starts with the reference to a murder. Instead of telling us more about this and telling us the consequences of this, the story then backpedals to tell us how the characters got to this part of their lives. We delve deep into characters' backstories involving characters that we don't even care about, and the narrative at times digresses into a dream-like quality where it describes the city with a capital C, which is, in my mind, very clearly New York City, but for some reason is unnamed. I didn't understand the point of this, nor did I particularly connect with any of the characters, and even though I recognized the writing style was skillful, for me, I feel like I would have had to study this book or have someone smarter than me tell me how to appreciate it in order for me to appreciate it at more than a 2-star level. So unfortunately, another Morrison miss for me, but that's okay. Her writing was still very lovely. I then decided to try 2 more picture books by Molly Idle. She wrote an illustrated Pearl, which is a mermaid picture book that I loved last year, and I decided to pick up Flora and the Flamingo. This is a silent picture book about how a girl and a flamingo learn to be friends through the art of dance. These illustrations were just the characters of Flora and the flamingo repeated over and over again in similar positions on the page with no background. It did have some interactive elements with flaps that the child reading could lift up to see a different picture. But for me, there wasn't enough, charm and variety and beautiful color work to the illustrations for me to love this. T-Rex is a tongue-in-cheek book about how to host a proper tea party. 2 children invite a Tyrannosaurus Rex over to their house for tea, and while the text tells us how to have a successful tea party, the illustrations show you how these children are not having a successful tea party. I think you can imagine what sort of hijinks ensue when you invite a full-size Tyrannosaurus Rex into your living room parlor for a tea party. However, this juxtaposition I thought was actually confusing. The text is telling the child reader how to do things properly, but then in the story, things aren't done properly. I might have just missed the point. I also didn't find the illustrations in T-Rex as delightful as those in Pearl, though that's probably just my mermaid bias coming in. I gave both of these picture books 3 out of 5 stars. I would be interested in exploring more of Molly Idle's work, but I have a feeling that Pearl will always be my favorite. Then I finished listening to the audiobook of The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. This is translated from Spanish by Magda Bogan. I didn't enjoy this one terribly much as well. As you can tell, my February was a bit lackluster, unfortunately. I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. On the surface, this is a multi-generational story about the Trueba family, and specifically also about the patriarch Esteban Trueba. However, upon finishing this and being confused and perturbed, I spoke with Sarai, who told me that this is actually more of an allegory for, I believe it's Chile, and the rise to the bloody revolutions that happened in Chile. I know nothing about this. I know nothing about Chile and its history, so I can't speak really at all about this. I'm not sure if knowing that it was an allegory for true historical events would have guided my reading experience. The main thing that hung me up on this, though, was there is so much lust and sex in here. It's not my favorite thing to have a book filled with lust and sex, and then in some cases rape as well. The thing that bothered me most about this was I felt that the reason why these characters were doing this was not necessarily emotionally motivated. It felt very much like breathing or eating to these characters, and it seemed like with every new character we had on the page, we had to have a sex scene with them and another character. It didn't seem at the time that these interactions were specifically for moving the plot forward, for creating new characters for us to learn about, nor did I feel like these scenes were specifically for character development or the emotional development of a pair of characters. To me, it felt like it was just something that the story had to do. and after a while I got annoyed that I had to read it. There were some really lovely magical realism elements to this that I felt worked better for me than some other magical realism I've read, but the repetitive, in my opinion, like over-sexualization of the story got on my nerves. The other thing that bothered me was, I won't give any spoilers, but at the end is suddenly incredibly brutal with very little resolution after it. Knowing this is an allegory, it makes me wonder if Allende had this beautiful magical realism multi-generational story that led up to the culmination of this bloody revolt, and then she wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible, or by that point the story was so long that she no longer had the time for us to resolve with these characters. But I just was left feeling, what was the point? I don't understand. And also the last 40 pages of the book were just really horrific, and that's the last thing that I remember about this. So I think I wasn't the right reader for this for whatever reason. And if you can shed some light on your opinions on the House of the Spirits, I would be happy to learn from you in the comment section. I am disappointed that this didn't work for me, but it's not the end of the world. Sarai and I embarked on another buddy read in February as well. We read The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon by Stephen King. I also gave this 2 out of 5 stars. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon follows Trisha, who is enamored with Tom Gordon and baseball. He's a baseball player. She gets lost in the woods on a hiking trip with her mother and brother, and then stuff starts getting weird. I did not realize that I had such fully formed expectations of what this story would be until I read this book and realized how disappointed I was. I started out really enjoying it, and especially enjoying the body horror elements of being stuck and lost in the woods, and something as simple as, I don't have bug spray and there are mosquitoes everywhere. I really like the idea of exploring how horrific nature truly can be when you're not prepared to face it. But then the story got supernatural in a way that was very dreamlike, and in a way that I just didn't like. I wanted it to be more concrete. I wanted it to be like a werewolf or a thing, something that I had a name for, and instead this supernatural sense that was following Trisha ended up being something that you couldn't really put your finger on, and something a little bit more ephemeral than I was expecting it to be. The timeline of this book also gets incredibly compressed in the second half. You're with Trisha for painstaking numbers of minutes and hours during the first half of her journey, and then in the second half of her journey, days are summed up in a matter of paragraphs. I don't know the purpose of this. She didn't have to be stuck out in the wilderness for X number of days, unless King researched how many days would it take for a child to get emaciated and delusional from lack of food, and so that's why he had to have an X number of day timeline. But for me, this book, that was quite short. It's less than 300 pages. I want to say that it's close to 200 pages, but I can't remember. Still felt too long. There was also no resolution at the end, which bummed me out. I was really looking forward to hearing the psychological repercussions of the things that Trisha had experienced, but the story was not concerned with giving us those, and I was left unsatisfied. 2 out of 5 stars for The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. I then managed to read a couple comics, but I'm only going to talk about Pretty Deadly Volume 2 in here. I'm going to talk about Volume 1, which is a reread, in a Hindsight is 2020 video. I quite liked Volume 2 of Pretty Deadly. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. This is a comic book that blends Wild Wild West with Death World mythology, and in this one, it's not so much Wild Wild West as it is World War I. I'm a bit of a sucker for stories set during World War I and II, just because they're so horrific and awful, but there's also something romantic about the tragedy of those conflicts. There was a sequence in here where we're being told a story about a farmer who, whenever something happens to him and someone comments, "Oh, that's bad luck," or "Oh, that's good luck," the farmer always says, "We'll see." And the point is that you're never quite sure when a thing that happens to you is good or bad until further events unfold and you get to recontextualize that event. While this is simultaneously happening, we're seeing this scene of intense action, and you're seeing things that you immediately judge as, "Oh, that's bad. Someone got injured. Oh, that's bad." But then in a next moment, you realize they're injured, so they're away from the spot where then a shell comes down. So it was actually good that they got injured. It felt very musical and cinematic and just like a perfect moment in this. But then that was kind of undone because in the next issue or chapter, I'm not quite sure, I can't remember exactly where it was divided up, you get the story of that farmer retold literally again, and I just didn't know why they slowed the story down to sit down and tell us the story with actual pictures from the story instead of the way that it was blended before. It felt so weird. I don't think that repetitive scene is what dropped this down 1 star or anything, but it was just the juxtaposition of one of the best sequences I've ever seen in comics with something that just immediately dilutes it is something I just wanted to talk to you guys about. I liked how the character development in this felt less heavy-handed than in the first volume, but I'm not really going to say very much else because then I'll be giving you too many thoughts about the first volume. So I still recommend the Pretty Deadly series. I enjoyed volume 2 quite a bit, and I'm glad that I got this off of my physical TBR as well. Then it was Thriller-a-thon time, which is a readathon hosted by Harriet Rosie, and it was running sometime in February. I didn't make a video on it because I was too darn lazy, but I did do a post on Instagram about my TBR. I kind of stuck with that and kind of didn't. I started reading Hamlet, the play by Shakespeare, but realized that my brain just wasn't with it, and I was reading for plot rather than for the language, and that's not a good way to approach Shakespeare. So I didn't finish it. I also didn't finish Death at Bishop's Keep by Robin Page. This is a Victorian mystery series written. Robin Page is a married couple writing together, Bill Albert and then Susan Wittig Albert, who will come up in just a moment. I got about halfway through this and realized that I just was not getting on with it. And even though there were a lot of elements in here that should have been my jam, like the Victorian setting and a female writer and family secrets and spinster women, I just didn't care. I also felt that a lot of the characters in here felt like Victorian caricatures. I had read these kinds of characters before. There wasn't anything really unique about them. And the mystery was developing oh so slowly. So I was like halfway through. I'd read like 160 pages, but I just didn't want to continue. So I ended up DNFing this and giving it 2 stars. I might attempt it in the future, but then I might not. I did finish Nightshade by Laurel K. Hamilton. This is a Star Trek The Next Generation novel. This was good. I'm nearly certain that all Star Trek The Next Generation novels, all Star Trek novels really, I would probably dip into some Deep Space Nine and Voyager novels eventually, if those exist, I haven't looked yet, are going to be 3 out of 5 stars. I sincerely doubt that any plot or character development would blow my mind for it to be a 4 or 5 star read, but I'm kind of pleased with this as well because I know what I'm going to get into with a Star Trek novel. It's going to be fun, it's going to be nostalgic, it'll remind me of the show, but it won't be anything that I'm going to have to sit aside emotional time to prepare myself for. I don't think I really want to go into the plot or even the characters of this. It was fine. I liked it. It was fun while it lasted. It's not particularly memorable, and that's okay. It was fun, and I finished it, and this is another one off of my physical TBR. The big success of Thriller-a-thon was Time of Death by Susan Wittig Albert. I picked this up when I was in the middle of the Robin Page Victorian mystery to see if this was more compelling and I could actually read this, and I really enjoyed this one. So this is a China Bayliss or Bales, I'm going to say Bayliss because that's how it's stuck in my head, mystery. She is a former lawyer, now the owner of a spice shop called Time and Seasons, I think, in Pecan Springs, which is a fictional town in Texas. There are a lot of things in here that were done really, really well. The town of Pecan Springs is incredibly detailed, and this book spends a lot of time developing it. This book spends probably as much time developing it as dealing with the central mystery. Pecan Springs sounds lovely. It has all these small town cozy vibes, cozy 1990s vibes, I should say. We hear about the plants that she's working with, the food that she's cooking, the things that she sees, the different shops of these handcrafted artisans that are on the same block as her shop. It's pretty idyllic and cozy. And as far as the mystery is concerned, even though China is a former lawyer, somehow the way that she got involved in this mystery felt natural. I never sat there questioning, now why would you be doing that? And because of her lawyer background, the way that she would look at crime scenes, I found was believable because she had looked at crime scenes, or at least crime scene photos, crime scene reports during her cases in court. The characters were also really well developed and they seemed like real people. Even the side characters that aren't going to last more than one book, I still felt like they were multifaceted people that I could sit down and have a cup of tea with. There is one instance of fat shaming in here. There's a character named Constance who's not particularly beloved by China, and China cannot help but describe her relating to a piece of food. So at one point she's described as a pumpkin, at another time she's described as a beet, and this continues into the second book, which I did actually read, and I'll talk about in a moment. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars just because I'm not sure. I don't think it would hold up to a 4 out of 5-star rating in the future, but if I believed in half ratings or like graduated ratings, this would be like a high 3-star for enjoyment. I really enjoyed this. Oh, I also couldn't predict the mystery, which pleased me to no end. Upon finishing that, I immediately jumped into the second one, which is Bane, because it's set at Halloween time, and I was so stoked for pumpkin spice recipes and cozy autumnal feelings of the town, and I was so disappointed. There is no autumnal coziness. Halloween passes us by in like the 3rd or 4th chapter with no mention of delightful trick-or-treaters and candlelit jack-o'-lanterns. China is so much more focused on the investigation and on actually investigating it. She suddenly turns into like a cop, and I'm just annoyed. My mom is reading this series. She's like on book 12, and I've asked her, and she said that this book definitely is different than the rest of the books, so I should keep going with the series and give it a try. I'd enjoy book 3 more. But yeah, I was disappointed. I still enjoyed it. It was still fun. I still like China. She also has a pet cat now. His name is Cat. I then picked up a nonfiction audiobook, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee, I believe is the subtitle, by Casey Sepp. I buddy read this with Acacia Ives, and I think we both were similarly underwhelmed by it. The way that this was presented to me, both through word of mouth on BookTube and by the book's own back blurb, even though I recognize that it's kind of ambiguous enough to where it wasn't an outright lie, I assumed that this was a book about Harper Lee's attempt to write a true crime book about a murder trial. So I assumed that this would be a severe microhistory looking at this trial specifically through the lens of Harper Lee attempting to write this true crime book, and also hearing about why this book never actually was finished. Instead, what this is a book that is completely split down the middle. The first half of the book is a nonfiction account of the murder trial in question. We get the background of the suspect, of the murder victim, of victims of the past, of also the lawyer, and the town. No sign of Harper Lee except for in like a prologue bit. Then at the end of this true crime novella, I guess you could say, even though does novella imply fiction? Novella length true crime work. We then switch over to novella length biography of Harper Lee. Not of Harper Lee writing this true crime book, Harper Lee, her entire life from birth to death. We do get to hear about the true crime book and her compiling the information, but not nearly as much as I felt like was insinuated. I also thought that this section of the book was incredibly judgmental of Truman Capote. And for me, it felt like the author putting forth her biases of Truman Capote rather than her representing the opinions of Harper Lee or representing someone else's opinions. I don't know very much about Truman Capote, except for that he was a flawed human being. Just the contempt that the narration held for him just stood out in a really awkward way. It's really hard for me to tell what I actually feel about the information in this book because the organization was so clunky. I really wish that it had been integrated. I really wish that if you wanted to tell both of these stories from beginning to end chronologically, that you alternated chapters and we slowly had the murder trial unfold as we got Harper Lee's biography. I wonder if putting the true crime portion at the beginning was there to pander to people who are picking this up solely for true crime. However, the subtitle, in my opinion, is there to pander to the bibliophiles and Harper Lee lovers. And if you're someone who loves books about books, or someone who loves Harper Lee, you have to read 50% of complete true crime before you get there. And if you're here only for the true crime, then you read the first half of the book, and do you even need to read the second half? Probably not. I don't know how this structure works for any reader. 3 out of 5 stars, probably should have given it 2, but I'm gonna hold by my 3 because it was very detailed in its research. I feel like she represented both that true crime portion and the Harper Lee portion as best that she could. It wasn't particularly enjoyable experience though. I also finished another nonfiction audiobook, Zen in the Art of Writing by Ray Bradbury. I don't recommend this audiobook. I really disliked Jim Frangione's narration. On a very basic level, his narration was incredibly irritating because he had a way of emphasizing parts of the words that he was speaking so that the volume of some words and some parts of the sentences are higher than other parts of sentences. So from a simple auditory level, you have parts that are too loud and parts that are too quiet. And this is just something that I really dislike with audiobook narrators. Also, because of this volume and also cadence rhythm that he had, it felt like these lines were being delivered with like force and drama that was separate from the actual sentences. Each sentence was treated the same by his voice, no matter what the sentence was actually saying. And for me, Bradbury is a sort of man who uses the word lovely genuinely in his prose. And I feel like that sort of tidbit of him, in my mind, I picture him as soft-spoken, quiet, and a gentle man who has these like crazy fantastic things going on in his head. And to have that picture of Bradbury paired with this voice that is bombastic and jarring and at sometimes painful to my ears was just so unpleasant. The other thing is that there were some comments that Bradbury made in here that were fat shaming, and it just a little bit destroyed my view of him and my opinion of him. It makes me really worried to like read a biography of him because I have this imaginary view of who Ray Bradbury is and I love his short stories so much that I'm kind of concerned about what I would find. I know that he's not a perfect human. This is also not one cohesive thing. It's individual essays that he wrote throughout his life pertaining to writing or creativity or his own writing that were compiled together. I really enjoyed hearing about the inception of some of his early stories. Do I think I'm going to remember what he said about them when I go to read them later this year? Probably not. The other thing that I remember about this, and I think this is also at the beginning of this work, is he said you should read poetry every day, and I like that idea. I think I'm going to try it. But I took away very little from this story, and the narration was awful, in my opinion. So I'm going to give it 2 out of 5 stars. Perhaps I will reread it in physical form in the future, or if I can find an audiobook that isn't Jim Frangione, but this was definitely a lackluster experience. So that's a lot of 2 stars that I talked about. February was definitely not the best month at all, but it looks like March is shaping up to be a much better one, which I'm really pleased about. The doldrums of February, even though it was leap year, it was going to be a good February, but then it wasn't. That's okay. So I want to talk about one book that I decided to unhaul, and then I'll tell you the state of my physical TBR. I've decided to unhaul The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights by John Steinbeck. I bought this because I love East of Eden. I like John Steinbeck's writing style, but I know he's an imperfect writer and individual. I've never read the King Arthur mythology. I don't know very much about the mythology, and I thought if I'm ever going to know the story of King Arthur, then it would probably be through Steinbeck. That sounds like a great plan. I read the foreword by Christopher Paolini, which informed me that this is unfinished, which I did not realize. Apparently, these are kind of first drafts. He started writing this. The later sections are better developed, but he put this down and then 9 years later he died. So that's annoying because I thought this was a finished Steinbeck approved project, and now knowing that it's unfinished and not as polished as he would have wanted and that he abandoned it for one reason or another kind of makes me disinclined to read it. And then bonus, it turns out, not surprisingly perhaps, that the Arthur mythology is full of a lot of misogyny. It starts out with the conception of Arthur being rape. No yay. No yay at all. As much as Steinbeck and other little boys of his generation loved playing knights in shining armor, I have a feeling that I'm not going to love the knights in shining armor. So I decided I could force myself to get through this, or I could just not. And I could just admit that John Steinbeck wrote one wonderful novel, and the rest of his stuff is not that great. So with reading 2 books off of my physical TBR and unhauling one, my physical TBR is now down to 14. I'm hoping to tackle it a bit more in the month of March, so fingers crossed. How was your February? Was it not as great as January? Are you excited that it's March? Can you believe it's almost spring? It's daylight savings time by the time you're watching this. Where does time go? I guess when you get old, you just don't do things. And then every day is like the last one. And then suddenly you're 30. Thank you for watching. And until next time, read some books that you actually enjoy and continue to be lovely. I also didn't fish